Hello and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. This happens to be Little Blue Book number 1419, and it is entitled Curious and Unusual Deaths, written by Russell R. Winterbotham. Now, this is video part 2 of this book, and I left off near the bottom of page 12. I must preface this continued reading with something. You must keep in mind that this was written in the 1920s, where ideas, thoughts, and the way we looked at different races was vastly different. Well, sort of. There's still people who look at races this way. But I'm going to read this as it is written. Our next subject under Curious and Unusual Deaths is titled Negro Lynchings. It is undoubtedly true that innocent men have been victims of race hatred. These men are in a way unwilling martyrs. There is on record a case of a woman who deliberately made up a story that a Negro attacked her and identified an innocent man as the one who committed the imaginary crime. The innocent Negro was transferred to the city jail where he awaited trial. A mob was formed which stormed the jail and abducted him. The leaders of the mob, in order to inspire terror in the hearts of the black citizens of the community, suggested that the man be hung in front of a hotel in the very heart of the business district. The Negro was saved by one of the sane individuals of the town, a judge, who arrived on the scene with 3 or 4 other men who were opposed to mob violence, just as the rope was being placed about the trembling Negro's neck. The judge argued with the mob while his friends strategically surrounded the Negro. At a given signal, the friends of the judge cut the rope and rushed the Negro into the hotel and out the back door. The judge and 1 or 2 others blocked the entrance until the escape had been made. Later, the Negro was taken secretly to another town. A few years later, the woman's story was openly discredited, and the Negro returned and lived the rest of his days unmolested among those who once threatened his life. At the time, however, the sparks of race hatred so ignited the spirit of mob violence that race rioting was barely avoided, and it did lead to the lynching of another Negro. 2 days after the attempted lynching, a white janitor at a railroad station discovered a colored hobo sleeping early one morning in the waiting room. The white man ordered him out. The Negro was an ugly character, and he drew a razor and slashed the janitor several times about the neck and shoulders. The police arrested the Negro and took him to jail. Although the white man's wounds were not serious, a jury was hastily paneled and a trial held that morning so that the Negro could be taken out of town before a mob could be assembled. By afternoon, the Negro was sentenced to a term in the state penitentiary. He was taken to the railroad station and placed on a train. The mob, hearing of the law's quick action, assembled and ran to the station. There they overpowered the deputies and the engineer of the train and dragged the Negro out of the coach. He was hanged on a telegraph pole in front of the station. It is curious that although the leaders of the mob could have been easily identified, no action was ever taken against them outside of the usual half-hearted investigation. This happened more than 35 years ago. Martyrs to sport. There are other cases of unwilling and perhaps foolish martyrs at the close of the Michigan deer hunting season in 1928. 8 hunters had sacrificed their lives so that 4,000 deer could be killed. The realm of sport has claimed other martyrs, football and baseball casualties and deaths from overexertion occur every year. An article in Plain Talk in 1928 declared that of 50 bare-knuckled prize-fighters of bygone years, 23 were champions. The average age of death was 43.24 years, a time when most men are in their prime. The death of 35 could be traced either to punishment in the ring, excessive training, or dissipation. Only 2 of these prize fighters died wealthy and 6 well-to-do, while 32 were poverty-stricken at the time of their death. In a list of 50 glove fighters, including 15 champions, the average age of death was 39.12 years. 2 were wealthy and 2 died well-to-do, while 32 went to their grave penniless. 35 died as a result of punishment in the ring, excessive training, or dissipation. A near martyr and a pacemaker. A near martyr and a peacemaker. A near martyr was the mayor of Cicero, Illinois, the home of gangsters and gunmen. Imagine his varied feelings one night when he found 12 sticks of dynamite planted under his front porch. A fuse an inch long was connected to the explosives. It had evidently spluttered out just before it reached the charges, thus saving the mayor and his family from death or serious injury. Also in the category of curious martyrs was a mother of Ashland, Kentucky, who rushed out of her house to stop a quarrel between her 2 daughters and some of the neighbors' children. She dropped dead from heart trouble during the excitement. Self-destruction. Edgar Allan Poe deplored the fact that there was little originality shown by self-destructionists of his time. There are very few unusual methods of suicide in America. Shooting one's self is the favorite method. Hanging is second, and poisoning runs third. Jumping from high places and drowning are also common methods of those who take their own lives. More men kill themselves than women. Men die violently by shooting or hanging. Poisoning is the favorite method used by women. As a rule, women select methods that will not mar their features. Student suicides. During the winter and spring of 1927, America was startled by an epidemic of a score of suicides among high school and college students in prominent institutions. Men and women attending Princeton, Yale, University of Chicago, University of Illinois, and University of Wisconsin joined in the latest college craze of dying by their own hands. Many newspapers attributed the suicides to the growth of modern materialism. Education was decried, but it cannot be said that education has been the cause of the somewhat common epidemics of suicide among Chinese and Japanese girls. It is also interesting to note that philosophers and scientists who are most pessimistic about a hereafter and who are the most materialistic do not contemplate self-destruction. One student found life not worth living hollow, tawdry, a snare, and a delusion. Another announced that he had done everything possible on this earth and he could see no reason for living longer. A third was interested in spiritualism, curious about the possibility of communicating from beyond. 3 others simply killed themselves without telling why. One of the latter 3, a youth who wrapped a rope around his neck and hanged himself, had received a note from his parents that day taking him to task for overdrawing his bank account. In the other 2 cases, it is presumed that curiosity played a large part. They wanted to know what death was like. A high school boy of Oakland, California killed himself with a rifle. His mother ascribed the act to a mild reproof for a bad grade in deportment at school. He left an incoherent and muddled note which said he was shooting himself to save his mother and sister from humiliation. A 16-year-old student in a Washington, D.C. high school shot himself with a revolver. He was walking through the corridors of the school while classes were in session. A friend, seeing him, stopped him. "Where are you going?" the friend asked. "I'm going to hell," the boy answered, nonchalantly drawing the revolver out of his pocket and blowing his brains out. His mother, teaching in a room nearby, heard the shot. The United Press carried a dispatch to the effect that the American students' suicide movement has reached England, and cited the case of a Cambridge undergraduate who had hanged himself. Figures compiled by the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company showed that suicide among miners was not on the increase during the winter and spring of 1927, in spite of the suicide epidemic. 2% of the suicides during this time were among miners, while in 1926 the rate was 5%. The rate has been on a downward trend since 1900. Between 15 and 20 years is the common age for miners to take their lives. According to the figures, the rate for girls is usually higher than for boys. During 1921, 1924, 1925, and 1926, the rate among boys was the highest. However, there are still more suicides than murders in the United States, even in the large cities, those of more than 100,000 population. In spite of gangsters and thugs, there were 16.3 suicides to 10.4 homicides in 1927 per 100,000 population. The moral of this is, watch yourself closer than you watch your neighbor if you expect to be murdered. A Negro suicide. Self-destruction is an interesting phenomena of human nature. It is not common among other living animals. It is true that some insects practice it, but here it is a means of preservation of the species. It is martyrdom rather than suicide. Colored people declare that their race does not often indulge in self-destruction. The writer recollects a case of a colored man's death that had all the earmarks of a suicide, although the coroner's jury didn't exactly call it such. Stabbing and slashing one's throat is an unusual method of suicide in the present day. Leaving on the gas and drowning is far more common. Even the rare occasion that someone throws himself in front of a train is more common than stabbing oneself. However, a certain colored man was found one morning in the basement of the store in which he had been working, half undressed, lying in a pool of his own blood. His razor was clasped in his hand, indicating that he had cut his own throat. His employer said that the man had been suffering from ill health and had been feeling downcast and despondent for several days. His colored friends insisted that the man did not commit suicide. Colored people never commit suicide, they declared. So the coroner's jury obligingly turned in a verdict of killed by hand or hands unknown. Odd cases of suicide. Reasons for committing suicide are often most trivial. A man in Groveville, New Jersey killed himself because his radio wouldn't function properly. He worked on it until late at night, then in disgust he quite suddenly ran out into his backyard and hanged himself. On January 4th, 1919, a disappointed lover ran amok near Little Sioux, Iowa, and shot himself and 5 others to death in a farmhouse. On March 14th of the same year, a man 46 years old ended his life by leaping from the New York City side of the Manhattan Bridge. His suicide followed the unsuccessful attempt on January 23rd of a sailor who jumped from the same bridge. The sailor suffered from an immersion and a bruised back. New York prosecutes attempted suicide as a crime. One winter, a woman in the streets in a western town went to the river for the dreadful purpose of committing suicide. Imagine her chagrin when, after having jumped in, she found the water only knee-deep. She waded out, and it is presumed that she is still managing to struggle along without dying. In another town, a parachute jumper who was barnstorming in that vicinity got acquainted with a young woman on Friday evening. The next day, the two were married. On Sunday, he was killed jumping from a plane. A chute was left dangling on the wing of the plane. A few days later, a woman turned up who claimed to be his first wife. This made him a bigamist. Then another wife was heard from. This made the man a polygamist. One of the airplane mechanics then offered the suggestion that it might have been a suicide. Disfiguring oneself. We had mentioned about that women commit suicide by methods that will not spoil their looks. While it does not come under the heading of suicide, there is an example of a young man who disfigured himself to avoid suspicion of a crime falling on him. One morning his foster parents were made violently ill after eating oatmeal. The boy was not taken sick. The incident was reported to the police as an attempt upon the lives of the family. The youth was questioned closely, but nothing was learned that might have led the police to believe he was guilty of the poisoning. A few weeks later, the boy came home nearly blinded, with his face badly burned with acid, which he claimed was thrown by a man who had passed him in another automobile as he drove the family car home from school. This time the police questioned the youth more fully, and the boy finally confessed that he had been experimenting with some chemicals. He decided to try a mild poison on his foster parents, and he had placed it in the oatmeal. When the police questioned him for the first time, he feared that he was suspected, and so he had thrown the acid on himself to avert suspicion. Newspaper sensations. Hardly a fortnight goes by without a new sensation in the columns of the newspapers. Only a few of the more classical examples will be cited here, and of these, only those dealing with death. Famous murders. The famous murders of recent years must only be mentioned briefly. To go into the subject in detail would require many volumes by itself. The newspaper space given to murders and murder trials is tremendous. Concerning the Hall Mills trial alone, 5 million words were written and sent from Somerville during the first 11 days of the trial. More than 200 newspapermen and newspaperwomen were interned in the New Jersey village for the duration of the trial. On the first day, 139,175 words were telegraphed in 8 hours. 28 Western Union operators, 60 leased wires, and the largest portable telegraph switchboard in the world were used in the transmission of the news to papers. On the third floor of the courthouse, an electric typewriter animated many others in newspaper offices all over the country. 8 daily newspapers leased houses for the use of their Somerville staffs. The New York Daily News had 16 men on the job, and the Daily Mirror had 13. Both are tabloid newspapers. 10 photographers, all that were allowed, were in the front line of the courtroom with their flashlights and cameras. 2 motorcycles rushed the plates from the scene of the trial to the nearest rapid transit station to be carried to newspaper and syndicate offices in New York City. It is estimated that 60 million persons followed the trial through the news columns. Yes, the public is interested in murder. A brief summary of some of the most sensational trials of the last decade will be given here. Leopold Leob. Nathan Leopold and Richard Leob confessed to the slaying of Bobby Franks for a thrill. They were given a life sentence in the Illinois State Penitentiary. The Shepard case. William D. Shepard was accused of killing his ward, N.W. McClintock, by means of typhoid germs. He was acquitted. Sacco Vanzetti. Nikolai Sacco and Bartolome Vanzetti were executed on August 23, 1927. They had been sentenced on scanty evidence in a muddled trial for a murder and hold-up in South Bantry, Massachusetts. There was considerable agitation throughout the world at the time, as it was claimed that the men were being executed because they were radicals. Sacco was an anarchist. The October 31, 1928 issue of The Outlook offers testimony which, if true, and it appears quite authentic, would clear Vanzetti for one of the crimes for which he was convicted. Snyder Gray. Ruth Brown Snyder and Henry Judd Gray were executed for the killing of Miss Snyder's husband, Albert Snyder, editor of Motorboating. Gerald Chapman, a mastermind type of criminal, executed for the murder of James Skelly during a mail robbery in New Britain, Connecticut. At one time, he escaped from the federal penitentiary at Atlanta, Georgia. Hickman, a youth who kidnapped Marion Parker, 12 years old, and secured $1,500 ransom from her father, a Los Angeles banker. Then he fiendishly murdered her, hacked off her legs, and delivered the dead body to her parent. He was captured, he confessed, and was executed. Hall Mills, a mystery murder in which a minister, Mr. Hall, was killed in company with Mrs. Mills, a choir leader. The minister's wife was suspected. No one was convicted, but the case was filled with details not often found outside the most thrilling detective stories. Witches make whoopee. We will cite also a well-known trial that had an odd background. It is the story of the murder rather than the trial itself, which deserves mention in a collection of curious and unusual deaths. This particular case is the witch murder, as the papers called it, of York, Pennsylvania. It was interesting in that it throws light on superstitious practices which exist in a modern world. The story of the murder was related by Wilbert Hess, who, with John Blymeyer and John Curry, was held for the slaying of Nelson D. Raymeyer. The three men went to the home of Raymeyer, who had been credited with practicing witchcraft for the purpose of securing a lock of his hair with which to break a spell it was alleged he had cast over them. Raymeyer appeared at a window in response to a knock at the door. Blymeyer, who was also said to be a witch, asked for a book. My lost friend. When Raymeyer came to the door, Blymeyer seized him and hit him over the head with a piece of wood. Blymeyer then handed the block of wood to Hess, who hit Raymeyer twice again. Curry took a halter that was nearby and tied the legs of the witch, so they could cut a lock of his hair. Raymeyer continued to struggle, and so Blymeyer, who must have been a tender-hearted person, floored him with a chair. Curry tied a rope around Raymeyer's neck. After the rope was pulled tight, he stopped breathing. Hess said it was his confession. I guess he was dead. The murderers set fire to the body and fled, trapped in a cave. Another famous death in recent years, which was not a murder and yet was a newspaper sensation, was that of Floyd Collins, a cave explorer who was imprisoned in a Kentucky cave. Collins was caught in Sand Cave near Cave City, Kentucky, when a heavy boulder fell on his foot, January 30th, 1925. He was searching for a way into Mammoth Cave. All efforts to release him failed. He was dead when his body was reached on February 16th. The remains were removed on April 23rd. This chapter takes us into deep water. While speaking of newspaper sensations, we might go on telling of marine disasters, death of transoceanic flyers, dirigible explosions, earthquakes, fire, flood, tornadoes, and other occurrences, including husband killing, without end, that have occupied newspaper headlines in years past. A line must be drawn somewhere. Famous last words. The reputed last words of noted men and women must be taken with a grain of salt. In many cases, the men and women who uttered them have become so idealized in history that it is quite possible that they said nothing of the kind. The words may only be what a witness thought was said, or what someone else thought ought to have been said. One can hardly believe all of them are true, but who is to say which ones are and which are not? Dying words of brave men and women. In some cases, such as that of Sir Philip Sidney, an English soldier, we have two last words. Sir Sidney fell mortally wounded on the battlefield. He asked for a drink. As a soldier handed him a bottle of water, Sir Sidney's eyes fell on a comrade who was also dying. The man's eyes looked longingly at the water bottle. Sir Sidney handed the flask to his dying comrade with the words, Thy necessity is greater than mine. In another place we read that Sir Sidney's last words were, I would not change my joy for the empire of the world. Perhaps he said both. Such a man deserves credit for both of them. No one has tried to speak humorously at death, at least no dying words of exactly humorous content have come down to us. Many of them have a tinge of the ludicrous and have a certain extravagance which is akin to humor. A few are attempts at bravado, but no one has conscientiously attempted to create belly laughter among those who watched him die. No one wants to have people laughing at him while he is dying. Sir Walter Raleigh's remarks as he was about to be beheaded come the closest to being genuinely humorous, but they are only the words of a debonair man of the world, and they are not an attempt to be funny, nor is it spontaneous humor. He said, It matters little how the head lieth. There are several similar examples given the list below. The bloody 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries gave the world the best dying words. A few Roman emperors also contributed to our list. Statesmen, patriots, and others. It is well, George Washington. Then I am safe, Oliver Cromwell. Independence forever, John Adams. Long live anarchy. Farewell, mother. Nicola Sacco. It is the last of earth, John Quincy Adams. I have endeavored to do my duty. Taylor. Gentlemen of the jury, you will now consider your verdict. Lord Tenterden. To die for liberty is a pleasure and not a pain. Marco Bozzaris. Let me die to the sounds of delicious music. Mirabeau. Remorse? Remorse? Write it, larger, larger. John Randolph. Give des Rolls a chair. Lord Chesterfield. Philosophers and scientists. The artery ceases to beat. Albert von Haller, a Swiss anatomist. Let the light enter. Goethe. Refresh me with great thoughts. Johann von Herder, German critic and poet. Taking a leap in the dark. Oh, mystery. Thomas Paine. I am taking a fearful leap in the dark. Thomas Hobbes. Preachers and heretics. I have peace. Charles Henry Parkhurst. I shall be happy. Archibald Sharp. What? Is there no bribing death? Cardinal Beaufort. My days are past as a shadow that remains not. Richard Hooker. I want nothing, and am looking for nothing but heaven. Philip Melanchthon. Be of good comfort, brother, for we shall this day light such a candle in England as shall never be put out. Hugh Latner to Nicholas Ridley, both burned at the stake as heretics. Poets, artists, musicians, and writers. I must sleep now. Lord Byron. I am about to die. Samuel Johnson. I feel as if I were myself again. Sir Walter Scott. Clasp my hand, my dear friend. I die. Count Vittorio Alfieri, Plendemonte's poet. A dying man can do nothing easy. Benjamin Franklin. My beautiful flowers, my lovely flowers. Richer. I feel the desire growing over me. John Keats. Let me hear those notes so long, my solace and delight. Mozart. We are all going to heaven, and Van Dyke is of the company. Thomas Gainsborough. Kings and emperors. Is this your fidelity? Nero to his servants. And this is death? George IV. An emperor should die standing. Vespasian. Don't let poor Nellie starve. Charles II. I thought that dying had been more difficult. Louis XVI. Farewell, Livia, and never remember our long union. Augustus Caesar. I have seen all things, and all things are of little value. Alexander Servius. Et tu Brute, and you Brutus. Julius Caesar. Soldiers and sailors. Don't give up the ship. James Lawrence. I would not change my joy for the empire of the world. Sir Philip Sidney. I thank God I have done my duty. Lord Nelson. Killed in action at Trafalgar. It matters little how the head lieth. Sir Walter Raleigh. James, take good care of the horse. General Winfield Scott. We are as near heaven by sea as by land. Sir Humphrey Gilbert. This is the last flickering of a lamp that has long been burning. General John Ellis Wool. Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees. Stonewall Jackson. I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. Nathaniel Hall. Nathan Hale. And brave women. I die through you. Joan of Arc to Pierre Coquin of Bevis. It is small, very small, and Boleyn, alluding to her neck. I do not sleep. I wish to meet death awake. Maria Theresa. O liberty, liberty, how many crimes are committed in thy name? Madame Roland. She was executed. There is a story behind each one of these utterances. These people died well, all of them. The Raymond Schoolhouse. While we were on the subject of last words, it might be well to mention the episode concerning S.N. Wood, one of the most conspicuous characters in the territorial history of Kansas, and the schoolhouse at Raymond, Kansas. It was one of the huge jokes of the day. The Santa Fe Railroad reached Hutchinson June 10, 1872, and from there it crossed the prairies to Great Bend and reached that town during July of 1872. Midway between Hutchinson and Great Bend is the site of Raymond, which was a town while the railroad was there. Gamblers, dance hall girls, and riffraff of the frontier settled at Raymond. Possibly a dozen persons really had legitimate businesses in the place while it was a town. One morning a notice was placed at the railroad station, presumably in S.N. Wood's handwriting, calling for an election of school bonds to build a schoolhouse. On July 30th, when the election was held, there were about 300 persons in Raymond. On August 26th, when 20 bonds of $500 each were issued as a result of the election, the population of Raymond had dwindled to S.N. Wood and 24 others. After a time, Wood sold the bonds for $750 each, and since he had the contract to build the schoolhouse, he pocketed the whole amount. The contract called for a school with a belfry and a good bell that could be heard for 2 miles. The records of the superintendent of Rice County Schools are incomplete before 1885. However, the episode is mentioned in a footnote of Kansas Historical Collections, Volume 7. Which declares that the district was 12 miles long and 6 miles wide, and the bell was good for only a 2-mile radius. The state legislature investigated the case in 1876 and found that no school had been built. Suit was brought against Wood and two banks which were used by Wood in disposing of the bonds, but the money was never procured. Wood was killed in a gun battle over the location of a county seat in Hugoton, Kansas on June 23, 1891. His dying words were said to be, "I bind myself to build Raymond School District a house for school purposes, and I will place in it a bell which can be heard 2 miles down the Arkansas." It was quite a speech for a dying man to make. Melodrama in Real Life. Conclusion. Perhaps the most melodramatic death in this entire collection is the one we have saved for the last. It is the tale of a girl in her teens who was madly in love with a railroad engineer. They had gone together for 2 years. On days when he was away, she would eagerly wait beside the tracks and watch for his return. As he passed by, she would wave her handkerchief at him. One day they had quarreled, such as all lovers have. The engineer refused to make up with his sweetheart. She waits by the tracks again for his return. The engineer saw her as he sped toward the town, but she did not wave her handkerchief at him this time. She had thrown herself in front of the train. Conclusion? This, of course, is not an exhaustive study of interesting, unusual, and curious deaths. Each day brings new and unusual tales of loss of life. The undertaker and the newspapers have an eye on all of us, for we may be the source of their next piece of merchandise. We have omitted several cases of members of faith healing cults who died when they might have been saved had they had a doctor. What did people do before they had doctors? The cultists inquire. Why? They died. Them too. Only a few conclusions may be made from the details gathered here. Unusual deaths are violent deaths, murders and suicides, as a rule, and they are deaths that might have been avoided. Of those mentioned in detail in this book, about 50% are the fault of the person who died. About 40% are the result of someone else's carelessness or intention. About 10% are unavoidable. Revolting, disgusting, and horrible deaths have been omitted. Only the most morbid person would care to read them. We might tell about the flour miller whose overhauls caught in the machinery of the elevator, but we won't. We'll quit. And that is the end of book 1419 of the Little Blue Book series, entitled Curious and Unusual Deaths, written by Russell W. Winterbotham.